May 12, 1944. Leuna, Germany. The synthetic oil plant, one of Germany's largest, operated at full capacity. The crackling towers processed coal into fuel. The storage tanks held enough aviation gasoline to keep the Luftwaffe flying for weeks. Workers moved between buildings, their shifts running around the clock, their production quotas met. At 1100 hours, the air raid sirens began to wail. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, received the first reports by telephone at his Berlin office that evening. The numbers were preliminary. The assessment was not. Leuna had been hit hard. Production was down 80%. He would later write, "I shall never forget the date, May 12th. On that day, the technological war was decided." If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. But 4 years earlier, in the winter of 1940, the Luftwaffe's leadership believed something very different. They believed that strategic bombing, the systematic aerial destruction of an enemy's industrial capacity, was largely ineffective. They had evidence, they had experience, and they were catastrophically wrong. To understand how Germany's Air Force could dismiss the very weapon that would destroy the Reich, we must return to 1936. Spain, the Condor Legion. The Luftwaffe sent volunteers to support Francisco Franco's nationalist forces in the Spanish Civil War. Among them was Erhard Milch, State Secretary of the Reich's Aviation Ministry. Milch studied the writings of Giulio Douhet, the Italian theorist who argued that strategic bombing could win wars by breaking civilian morale and destroying industrial production. On April 26, 1937, the Luftwaffe tested Douhet's theory. The target was Guernica, a small Basque town with no military significance. 28 aircraft dropped about 45 tons of high explosives and incendiaries. The town burned. 1,600 people died. Milch observed the results carefully. He noted the destruction, the casualties, the international outcry. Then he noted something else. The Republican forces did not collapse. Their morale did not break. Instead, Guernica became a rallying cry. The bombing hardened resistance rather than softening it. The Luftwaffe conducted a systematic audit of Republican civil defense measures in Madrid, which had also been bombed extensively. The conclusions were documented in internal reports. First, air raid shelters provided substantial protection against all but direct hits. Second, and more importantly, adequate shelter and civil defense training maintained civilian morale rather than destroying it. The experience in Spain, one Luftwaffe report stated, had upheld the usefulness of attacks against industries and transportation centers, but had also provided strong evidence that terror bombing was unlikely to seriously demoralize a population provided with adequate civil defense shelters and training. General Hugo Sperle, who commanded the Condor Legion, sent detailed operational reports back to Germany. He recognized that accidents, weather, and night flying proved deadlier than the enemy. The Luftwaffe lost more planes to these circumstances than to Republican defenses. These lessons informed every aspect of German doctrine, from weather services to flight training, from communications to maintenance. The conclusion was clear. Strategic bombing against civilian targets was ineffective. Tactical bombing in support of ground operations was effective. The Luftwaffe should be designed as a tactical air force, optimized for cooperation with the army. General Lieutenant Walther Wever, the Luftwaffe's first chief of staff, disagreed. Wever was an advocate for strategic air power. He pushed for the development of 4-engine heavy bombers, aircraft capable of reaching deep into enemy territory with significant bomb loads. Under his leadership, the Luftwaffe developed the Junkers Ju-89 and the Dornier Du-19, both 4-engine strategic bombers. Then, on June 3, 1936, Wever died in a flying accident. He was 49 years old. With Wever gone, the strategic bomber program lost its champion. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, was skeptical of heavy bombers. So was Erhard Milch, They believed Germany's industrial capacity, limited in raw materials and production capability, could only produce about 1,000 four-engine bombers per year. The same resources could produce many times that number of twin-engine medium bombers. The math seemed compelling. 1 heavy bomber, or 5 medium bombers. The medium bombers could be deployed faster, supported more easily, and lost more readily, without catastrophic impact on force strength. In the spring of 1937, just when the Ju-89 and Do-19 had passed testing and were ready for production, Göring ordered a halt to all work on the four-engine strategic bomber program. The decision would prove fatal. But in 1937, it seemed logical. The Luftwaffe was being designed for Blitzkrieg, lightning war, a doctrine that emphasized speed, shock, and the close coordination of air and ground forces. For Blitzkrieg, tactical bombers were perfect. For a longer campaign, for a war of attrition against an industrial power, they were catastrophically insufficient. The Luftwaffe tested its new doctrine in Poland in September 1939. It worked. Polish resistance crumbled within weeks. The Luftwaffe tested it again in France in May and June 1940. It worked again. French defenses collapsed. The British Expeditionary Force was evacuated from Dunkirk. By June 22nd, France had signed an armistice. The Blitzkrieg doctrine had proven itself. Germany had conquered most of Western Europe in less than a year. The Luftwaffe's tactical focus seemed vindicated. Then came Britain. On July 10th, 1940, the Battle of Britain began. The objective was clear: destroy the Royal Air Force, achieve air supremacy over the English Channel, and enable Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. The Luftwaffe launched attacks against RAF airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. Initially, the strategy was working. RAF Fighter Command was taking unsustainable losses. By early September, the British were down to their last reserves of pilots and aircraft. A few more weeks of concentrated pressure on RAF airfields, and the British air defense system would have collapsed. Then, Hitler changed the objective. On September 7, 1940, the Luftwaffe shifted from attacking military targets to bombing London. But the reason was retaliation. On August 25th, RAF bombers had struck Berlin. The damage was minimal: a few buildings hit, a handful of casualties, but the psychological impact was enormous. Hermann Göring had famously declared that if a single enemy bomber reached the Ruhr, his name was not Göring. You could call him Meyer. The RAF had not only reached the Ruhr, they had reached Berlin. Hitler demanded retaliation. The Luftwaffe was ordered to bomb London, to break British civilian morale, to force Britain to negotiate for peace. It was the exact strategy that the Luftwaffe's own experience in Spain had shown to be ineffective. The Blitz began. From September 7th, 1940, through May 1941, the Luftwaffe bombed British cities: London, Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, Belfast, Glasgow, Cardiff. Over 12,000 tons of bombs were dropped on London alone. More than 40,000 British civilians were killed. Over 1 million homes were destroyed or damaged. And British morale did not break. Citizens in rural areas watched dogfights during afternoon picnics. Damaged German planes that made emergency landings on golf courses were greeted by bystanders offering beer to surviving RAF pilots. If the pilot who emerged was German, people would run from all directions, eager to see the enemy up close. When Winston Churchill visited bombed neighborhoods, people cheered. They shouted for him to send bombers back to Germany. Civilian morale did not collapse. The British economy did not collapse. War production actually increased. The Luftwaffe was suffering mounting casualties for no strategic gain. Pilots and aircraft were being lost at a rate Germany could not sustain. By May 1941, the Blitz ended, not because it had succeeded, but because it had failed. The Luftwaffe needed its bombers elsewhere. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was about to begin. The lessons were clear. Strategic bombing against civilian targets had failed to break British morale. The Luftwaffe lacked the heavy bombers necessary for sustained strategic campaigns. Terror bombing did not work. The British had proven it. But if the lessons were clear, the implications were ignored, because if strategic bombing was ineffective, then Germany had nothing to fear from Allied bombers. The RAF could not break German morale any more than the Luftwaffe had broken British morale. Strategic bombing was a waste of resources. The real war would be won or lost on the ground. This belief would persist in German leadership throughout 1941, 1942, and into 1943, even as RAF Bomber Command grew stronger, even as the United States Army Air Forces began arriving in Britain, even as the tonnage of bombs dropped on German cities increased month by month. The RAF dropped only 62,000 tons of bombs on Germany in 1940 and 1941 combined. The damage was real, but limited. Industrial production continued to rise. German war production in 1941 exceeded that of 1940. Production in 1942 exceeded that of 1941. The evidence seemed to support the German assessment. Strategic bombing was not decisively effective. It caused disruption, certainly. It killed civilians, unquestionably. But it did not cripple industrial output. It did not break morale. It did not win wars. In February 1942, Air Marshal Arthur Harris took command of RAF Bomber Command. Harris believed passionately in strategic bombing. He believed that air power, properly applied, could win the war without a costly land invasion. He believed that Germany's cities could be systematically destroyed, that German industry could be crippled, that German morale could be broken. Harris implemented a new policy: area bombing. The objective was not to hit specific factories or military installations. The objective was to destroy entire urban areas, to make German cities uninhabitable, to kill workers and destroy their homes, to create such devastation that Germany's capacity to wage war would simply collapse. On the night of May 30th to 31st, 1942, 1,040 RAF bombers attacked Cologne. It was the first 1,000-bomber raid in history. 1,500 tons of bombs were dropped in 90 minutes. 45,000 people were left homeless. Over 3,000 buildings were destroyed. 469 people were killed. The damage was significant, but Cologne continued to function. Factories were repaired, rubble was cleared, production resumed. Within weeks, industrial output had largely recovered. The pattern repeated throughout 1942 and into 1943. Major raids on Essen, Hamburg, Kassel, Darmstadt, Düsseldorf, Frankfurt, thousands of tons of bombs, thousands of civilians killed, hundreds of thousands made homeless. But German industrial production continued to rise. In February 1942, Albert Speer became Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production. Speer was an architect by training, not an industrialist, but he understood organization, efficiency, and the elimination of bureaucratic obstacles. Under Speer's leadership, German armaments production was rationalized and centralized. Factories operated on multiple shifts. Production lines were standardized. Resources were allocated more efficiently. The results were dramatic. In 1942, Germany produced 4,100 tanks. In 1943, 5,900. Ammunition production quadrupled, artillery production tripled, aircraft production doubled. This was the armaments miracle. German war production was increasing despite the bombing. The Luftwaffe's assessment seemed vindicated. Strategic bombing was disruptive but not decisive. It could not break industrial capacity. It could not break morale. It could not win wars. But there was something the German leadership did not fully understand. The bombing was not yet concentrated enough. The tonnage was not yet high enough. And, critically, the targets were not yet the right ones. In 1943, RAF Bomber Command dropped 676,000 tons of bombs on Germany, 10 times the tonnage of 1940 and 1941 combined. The destruction was no longer scattered, It was concentrated, systematic, overwhelming. On the night of July 24th to 25th, 1943, 791 RAF bombers attacked Hamburg in Operation Gomorrah. They dropped 2,300 tons of bombs. 3 days later, they returned with 722 aircraft and dropped another 2,300 tons. The raids continued for 9 days. Over 9,000 tons of bombs were dropped on the city. The bombing created a firestorm, a phenomenon where tens of thousands of individual fires merge into a single, massive conflagration that generates its own weather system. Winds reached 150 miles per hour. Temperatures exceeded 800 degrees Celsius. The firestorm consumed 8 square miles of the city center. 42,000 people were killed in a single night. 900,000 were made homeless. Hamburg was no longer just damaged. Hamburg was destroyed. The psychological impact rippled through Germany. If Hamburg could be annihilated, any city could be annihilated. Nowhere was safe. Albert Speer visited Hamburg on July 29th, the day after the firestorm. He walked through the ruins, talked to survivors, inspected the damage to industrial facilities. What he saw terrified him. Not just the physical destruction, which was bad enough, but the psychological impact. The survivors he spoke to were no longer talking about victory. They were talking about survival. Some were talking about surrender. Speer rushed back to the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, to brief the Führer personally. He brought photographs. He brought detailed damage assessments. He brought eyewitness accounts. He tried to convey the scale of what had happened, the unprecedented nature of the destruction, the implications for German morale and industrial production. Hitler looked at the photographs for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he pushed them aside. "Speer," Hitler said, his voice quiet and cold, "I forbid you to show me any more photographs from air raids." It was not anger. It was something stranger and more disturbing. It was refusal. A simple, absolute refusal to acknowledge what was happening to German cities. The disconnect between Hitler's refusal to see and the reality unfolding over Germany was absolute. While the Führer studied maps of the Eastern Front, the skies over the Reich were filling with bombers, not hundreds, thousands. By early 1944, the strategic bombing campaign had entered a new phase. The United States 8th Air Force, based in England, now flew daylight, some precision bombing raids. The RAF continued night area bombing. Between them, they could attack German targets around the clock. There was no respite, no recovery time, no opportunity for the system to stabilize. The RAF had upgraded to Avro Lancaster bombers, 4-engine heavy bombers, capable of carrying over 5 tons of bombs. Some modified Lancasters could carry 11-ton bombs for special missions. The Americans flew Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses and consolidated B-24 Liberators, both 4-engine heavy bombers with substantial payload capacities. Through 1944, the Allies dropped an average of 3,000 tons of bombs on Germany every day. 3,000 tons, daily, month after month. To put this in perspective, the entire Luftwaffe Blitz on London from September 1940 through May 1941 dropped approximately 12,000 tons total. The Allies were now dropping that amount on Germany every 4 days. But tonnage alone does not tell the complete story. What mattered was where those bombs fell. In June 1943, the combined chiefs of staff had issued the point-blank directive. The primary objective was the destruction of German fighter production. The reasoning was straightforward. The planned invasion of France in June 1944 required air superiority. Without destroying the Luftwaffe, the invasion would fail. Allied bombers systematically attacked Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf factories. They hit aircraft assembly plants, ball-bearing factories, anything connected to fighter production. The raids were devastating, but German aircraft production did not collapse. In fact, it continued to increase. In 1943, Germany produced 25,000 aircraft. In 1944, 39,807 aircraft. Even under the most intense bombing, production was rising. How was this possible? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Part of the answer was the armaments miracle. Speer's rationalization of industry created excess capacity and resilience. When one factory was hit, production shifted to another. Factories were dispersed, some were moved underground. Machine tools proved remarkably durable. Even when buildings were destroyed, the machinery could often be salvaged and reinstalled elsewhere. But there was another factor. The Allies were attacking the wrong targets. German industry ran on coal. Coal powered the steel mills. Coal heated the factories. Coal generated the electricity. And coal was moved by one primary method: railroads. The German National Railway, the Reichsbahn, was the backbone of the entire German war economy. It transported coal from the mines in the Ruhr and Silesia to factories across Germany. It moved raw materials to production centers. It distributed finished weapons to the front lines. It evacuated wounded soldiers from the battlefield. It transported forced laborers to factories and concentration camps. The Reichsbahn operated on a finely balanced system: just-in-time delivery, minimal stockpiles, maximum efficiency. The system worked brilliantly under normal conditions, but it had one critical vulnerability: it had no redundancy. Any significant disruption to the rail network would cascade throughout the entire economy. Allied air planners understood this in theory, but through 1943 and into early 1944, they did not prioritize transportation targets. They focused on factories, on cities, on aircraft production, on ball bearings, on oil refineries. These targets seemed more important, more directly connected to German military capability. They were wrong. In late 1944, Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, Deputy Supreme Allied Commander, built a new strategic consensus. The focus shifted to transportation: rail yards, railway bridges, canals, anything that moved coal. The transportation plan went into effect in the autumn of 1944. The results were catastrophic for Germany. In the last week of August 1944, the Reichsbahn loaded 900,000 freight cars. By December, that number had fallen to less than 500,000. Freight capacity had been cut nearly in half in 4 months. On November 2nd, 1944, 172 B-24 Liberators damaged the Bielefeld Viaduct so badly it closed for 9 days. More B-24s hit the target again, closing the viaduct for 11 more days. On the same day, 144 B-24s hit the Altenbeken Viaduct so severely it shut down until February. 157 B-24s bombed the Mittelland Canal so badly that it was shut down for the remainder of the war. Coal movement by waterway fell from 2.2 million tons in August to 454,000 tons in November. The bombing of transportation infrastructure had a multiplier effect that factory bombing never achieved. When a factory was hit, that factory stopped producing. When a rail yard was hit, dozens of factories lost their coal supply simultaneously. Steel mills could not operate. Power plants went offline. Chemical plants shut down. Oil refineries ceased production. Ammunition factories went idle. And unlike factories, which could be dispersed or moved underground, transportation infrastructure was fixed in place. Bridges could not be hidden. Rail yards could not be relocated. Canals could not be disguised. The targets were obvious, vulnerable, and irreplaceable. By January 1945, the German economy was in free fall. Steel production collapsed from 2.7 million tons in March 1944 to 600,000 tons in February 1945, a 78% decline in 11 months. But it was not just steel. Coal production fell. Electricity generation declined. Chemical production plummeted. Oil refineries, even those undamaged by direct attack, shut down because they could not receive coal shipments to power their operations. The entire system was collapsing. Not because individual factories had been destroyed, but because the network connecting them had been severed. Albert Speer watched it happen with growing horror. On March 15, 1945, he addressed a report directly to Hitler. The German economy is heading for inevitable collapse within 4 to 8 weeks. 4 to 8 weeks. That was all Germany had left. Not because of battlefield defeats, though those were mounting. Not because of manpower shortages, though those were severe. But because the industrial system that supplied the front lines was shutting down. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But there was another target set that proved equally decisive: oil. Germany had never been self-sufficient in oil. The Reich had access to two primary sources: natural crude from the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești and synthetic fuel produced from coal through the Fischer-Tropsch and Bergius hydrogenation processes. Before the war, British intelligence had identified Germany's dependence on oil as a critical vulnerability. The Western Air Plan, BASE 5C, developed before the war, designated oil as a priority target. But through the early years of the war, oil targets received limited attention. There were always other priorities: submarine pens, aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, city centers. The first major attempt to target oil came on August 1, 1943. Operation Tidal Wave, 178 B-24 Liberators of the 8th and 9th Air Forces launched a low-level raid on the Ploiești refineries in Romania, deep inside Axis-controlled territory. The raid was a disaster. Many of the pilots were inexperienced, trained in the clear skies of Texas, unprepared for hostile territory. The formations became scattered. Aircraft got lost. The low-level approach made the bombers vulnerable to every form of ground fire. German and Romanian defenders were waiting. 54 B-24s were lost. Over 500 airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. The damage to the refineries was significant but temporary. Production resumed within weeks. The lesson seemed clear. Oil targets were too well defended, too difficult to hit effectively. The campaign against oil was deprioritized. But in March 1944, a new plan emerged. The Plan for Completion of Combined Bomber Offensive proposed attacking 14 synthetic oil plants and 13 refineries. The plan estimated that Axis oil production could be reduced by 50% through bombing, cutting it to 33% below what Germany needed. The plan was approved. On May 8, 1944, the oil campaign began in earnest. On May 12, 1944, B-17s of the 8th Air Force struck the Luna synthetic oil plant near Mersburg. The plant was one of Germany's largest, producing aviation gasoline from coal. The raid was precise and devastating. Production dropped 80% overnight. Albert Speer received the damage assessment that evening. He immediately recognized what the Americans had done. They had found Germany's Achilles heel. 4 days later, Speer met with Hitler. "The enemy has struck us at one of our weakest points," Speer told him. "If they persist at it this time, we will soon no longer have any fuel production worth mentioning. Our one hope is that the other side has an Air Force General Staff as scatterbrained as ours." They persisted. Throughout May and June 1944, Allied bombers systematically attacked every major synthetic oil plant in Germany. The 15th Air Force, operating from Italy, struck Ploiești again and again. Between May and August, 5,600 bomber sorties targeted the Romanian refineries. Production fell from 186,000 tons per month to 81,000 tons in May, then to 44,000 tons by August. On August 22, 1944, as Soviet forces approached Romania, the country switched sides and joined the Allies. Ploiești was lost. Germany's largest source of natural crude oil was gone. The synthetic plants in Germany were faring no better. They had been producing an average of 316,000 tons of oil per month when the campaign began. By June, production had fallen to 107,000 tons. By September, 17,000 tons. Aviation gasoline production collapsed even more dramatically, from 175,000 tons in April to 30,000 tons in July to 5,000 tons in September. The Germans viewed the attacks as catastrophic. In a series of letters to Hitler, collected by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey after the war, the developing crisis was outlined month by month in detail. On June 30th, Speer wrote to Hitler, "The enemy has succeeded in increasing our losses of aviation gasoline up to 90% by June 22nd. Only through speedy recovery of damaged plants has it been possible to regain partly some of the terrible losses. The Germans threw everything they had into defending the oil plants. Anti-aircraft guns were concentrated around synthetic fuel facilities. Fighter squadrons were deployed specifically to protect refineries. Repair crews worked around the clock. Every time a plant was hit, workers descended on the damage, welding, rebuilding, improvising. Sometimes production could be partially restored within days, but the Allied bombers kept coming. As soon as a plant resumed even partial production, it was hit again. The Germans were trapped in an endless cycle of destruction and repair, never able to fully recover before the next wave of bombs fell. By December 1944, consumption of oil exceeded production. Germany was burning through its stockpiles. Accumulated reserves, carefully built up over years, were vanishing. Within 6 months, they would be practically exhausted. The impact on military operations was immediate and severe. In August 1944, the final run-in time for aircraft engines was cut from 2 hours to half an hour. There was not enough fuel for proper testing. Pilot training, already reduced, was cut further. New pilots were being sent into combat with dangerously inadequate flight hours. On the Eastern Front, panzer divisions found their movement increasingly restricted, not because they lacked tanks. Germany was still producing tanks, but the tanks had no fuel. They sat immobile, expensive steel coffins waiting for gasoline that would never arrive. When Germany launched the Ardennes offensive on December 16, 1944, the last major German counterattack of the war, fuel reserves were insufficient to support the operation. German planners were counting on capturing Allied fuel supplies to continue the offensive. When that failed to happen, panzer divisions ran out of fuel in the middle of the battlefield. Tanks were abandoned. Entire units became immobilized. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was effectively grounded, not because it lacked aircraft. Aircraft production had continued through 1944, but there was no fuel. Thousands of aircraft sat unused on airfields, their tanks empty. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had become a pathetic figure. The man who had once promised that no enemy bomber would reach the Ruhr was now watching Allied aircraft fly over Germany at will. His Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was impotent. Hitler increasingly cut Göring out of military conferences. When Göring did attend, Hitler would ignore him completely, addressing questions to other officers, acting as if the Reichsmarschall were not in the room. It was calculated humiliation, and everyone noticed. Göring himself told his entourage in 1944 that he knew the war was lost the moment he saw the first B-17 bombers over Berlin, accompanied by long-range P-51 Mustang fighter escorts. The escorts changed everything. Without fighter escorts, bombers had been vulnerable. German fighters could attack them during their approach, during their bombing runs, during their withdrawal. The losses had been acceptable to the Allies, but significant. The P-51 Mustang arrived in force in early 1944. With drop tanks, the Mustang had a combat radius of over 1,800 miles. It could escort bombers all the way to targets deep inside Germany, engage German fighters on their own territory, and return to England. German fighter pilots were being ground down through attrition. In each of the first 3 months of 1944, over 1,000 German fighters were shot down. The casualties were not just aircraft. They were pilots, trained, experienced combat pilots who could not be replaced. Fighter pilot attrition in the Luftwaffe reached 90%. In May 1944 alone, the Luftwaffe lost 489 trained pilots. The training centers produced 396 new pilots. For the first time, losses exceeded replacements. New pilots were being rushed through abbreviated training programs. Flight hours were cut. Advanced tactical training was eliminated. Young men, barely out of their teens, were being sent into combat against experienced Allied pilots flying superior aircraft. The results were predictable. The Luftwaffe's effectiveness collapsed. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, Germany had 815 fighters available. They flew only 100 sorties over the landing beaches, 100 sorties, against the largest amphibious invasion in history. The reason was simple. There was no fuel. The aircraft existed. The pilots, inadequately trained but present, existed. But the gasoline to fly them did not exist in sufficient quantities. By late 1944, Germany's war machine was starving. Not for lack of factories, not for lack of workers, not for lack of weapons, but for lack of fuel and transportation. The bombing campaign had finally found the targets that mattered. Through 1943, German industry had proven resilient. Factories could be rebuilt, production could be dispersed, workers could be replaced with slave labor from occupied territories. The armaments miracle had been real. Germany had been producing more weapons than ever before. But resilience had limits. When the transportation network collapsed, it did not matter how many factories Germany had. Without coal, the factories could not operate. When the oil refineries were destroyed, it did not matter how many tanks Germany produced. Without fuel, the tanks were useless. The Luftwaffe's assessment from 1940 had been based on incomplete data. Strategic bombing against civilian morale had failed in Britain, but strategic bombing against critical infrastructure, oil, transportation, power generation succeeded catastrophically. The difference was target selection. Bombing cities killed civilians and destroyed homes, but did not cripple industrial systems. Bombing railroads and refineries did. By January 1945, Germany was producing almost no oil. The transportation system was paralyzed. Industrial production was in freefall. The economy was collapsing. Between 1939 and 1945, Allied aircraft dropped approximately 2.7 million tons of bombs on Europe. Roughly half of that, approximately 1.3 to 1.5 million tons, fell on Germany itself. The tonnage was staggering. For comparison, the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima had the explosive power of approximately 15,000 tons of TNT. The conventional bombing of Germany represented the equivalent of about 90 atomic bombs spread across 6 years and hundreds of targets. But it was not the tonnage that decided the war. It was the timing and the targets. The bombing from 1940 through 1943 had been brutal but not decisive. The bombing from mid-1944 through 1945 was both. In September 1944, approximately 800,000 German workers were engaged in air defense. Another 1 million Luftwaffe personnel were on cleanup duty after raids. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were involved in reconstruction efforts. This represented a massive diversion of resources from the front lines. 14,000 heavy anti-aircraft guns and 40,000 light anti-aircraft guns were deployed across Germany for air defense. These guns required millions of shells. They required crews to operate them. They required logistics to supply them. All of this was manpower and material that could not be used against Soviet forces in the East or Allied forces in the West. The bombing campaign had become, as Albert Speer called it, a second front. Not a front in the traditional sense, with armies maneuvering and battles being fought, but a front that consumed German resources relentlessly, that forced the diversion of critical assets, that degraded the capacity to fight everywhere else. And unlike a traditional front, this front could not be stabilized. German forces could conduct strategic withdrawals on the Eastern Front, shortening their lines, trading space for time. They could not withdraw from their factories. They could not shorten the rail lines. They could not trade their oil refineries for time. The strategic targets were fixed, vulnerable, and essential. The collapse accelerated through the winter of 1944 to 1945. In January, February, and March 1945, Allied bombers dropped more tonnage on Germany than in any previous 3-month period. The infrastructure that remained was systematically destroyed. Cities that had survived earlier raids were obliterated. Dresden was destroyed in February 1945, creating another firestorm that killed approximately 25,000 people. The raid was controversial, even at the time. The war was clearly ending. Germany was collapsing. Was the destruction still necessary? The question reveals the fundamental paradox of the strategic bombing campaign. It had taken years to become decisively effective. By the time it was working, Germany was already losing on multiple fronts. How much did the bombing contribute to victory, and how much was simply added destruction to an already defeated enemy? The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted after the war, concluded that strategic bombing had been effective but not independently decisive. The destruction of the Luftwaffe had been crucial for the success of D-Day. The attacks on oil had crippled German mobile operations. The destruction of transportation had paralyzed the economy. But the survey also concluded that the impact of strategic bombing could not be separated from the general collapse of Germany in 1945. Germany was losing on the Eastern Front. Germany was losing on the Western Front. Germany had lost most of its conquered territory. The bombing accelerated collapse, but did not solely cause it. Albert Speer, interrogated extensively after the war, estimated that strategic bombing had reduced German industrial output by 20 to 30% below what it could have been. A significant impact, certainly, but not the total devastation that pre-war theorists like Duhay had predicted. German morale had not collapsed, despite losing their homes, despite watching their cities burn, despite hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties. Germans continued working. They continued fighting. Resistance did not end until Allied armies physically occupied Germany in May 1945. The Luftwaffe's assessment from 1940 had been partially correct. Strategic bombing alone could not break civilian morale, but it had been wrong about everything else. Strategic bombing could cripple transportation, it could eliminate oil production, it could paralyze an industrial economy. It just took the right targets, the right tonnage, and enough time to achieve cumulative effects.